I've had a lot to say over the last week, and from what I'm told, some of you are still working your way through the document. So in view of that, my presentation today hopefully is going to be fairly brief. You know that Americans are quite fond of polling, and they've been tracking the right track, wrong track question in the USA for quite some time. So perhaps I'll begin today by trying to see if this group is going to be brave enough to indicate to me what your consensus is. Perhaps may I be so bold as to ask you your impression, Rotarians, of whether it is your sense that the country is on the right track or the wrong track. Those on the right track. Right track. Country's on the right track.
We're on the path. We're on the path. We're on the track. We're on the right track.
It fundamentally is one of those all in.
Red Eyes and y'all got some pimps in here now, so you better stay.
Fundamentally, it's one of those all-encompassing questions designed to get a temperature reading of the electorate. Nothing nefarious about it. The question is, if we were to do a poll today in the Bahamas, I don't know what the answer to the question is going to be, but what is pretty clear is there is a general sense of concern about where the country stands. And fundamentally, it is driven by a whole host of issues. The crime problem obviously continues to provide a lot of anxiety, even fear, and in a lot of cases out of nothing more than the sense of concern about one's own personal safety. The Minister of National Security attempted to assuage our anxieties some time ago by telling us that in a lot of ways it's the drug boys who are at war with themselves. And not long after that, the Prime Minister was on Jeffrey Lloyd's program and rhetorically asked Mr. Lloyd what it is Mr. Lloyd, in response to his probing question, expected him to do about the social problem that the country was facing. Invariably, the Prime Minister was getting at the fact that it is unreasonable for the host and members of the public to look to him to wave some magic wand and solve the myriad of social problems that were besetting the country. And of course, as business people, you know that given the high level of global competitiveness that we face, most reasonable persons acknowledge that we've got to raise our performance bar when it comes to education. The reality is that not all of our challenges are created equal. Some are more profound than others. On the one hand, there's a palpable sense of frustration because by any reasonable means, people get the sense that there are some problems that plague us that should have been solved a long time ago. And they can't understand why these vexing problems continue to repeat themselves. I won't enumerate those problems today. You listen to any of the talk shows, from the reasonable to the unreasonable, and you get a flavor of the kinds of things that people complain about on a day-to-day basis. The question for us in the Bahamas is, what is the solution to those problems? How do we change the Bahamas and tackle all of the issues that face us? I'm not a fan of motivational speakers, but a few years ago I stumbled over Tony Robbins trying to provide some guidance to people as to how to go about maintaining the New Year's resolutions that they make. Because, as you know, people make them and by January 3rd or 4th, they're forgotten. So he suggested there were a couple ways to permanently set in those standards. The first, he said, was to raise your standards. Whatever it is where you were before, make a personal determination that you're going to raise your personal standard of performance. The second approach, he said, to ensure lasting change is to change your belief, system of belief. In essence, the question of whether you believe that you are able to achieve these high standards. You either feel you can or you feel that you can't. The third approach, he said, was you've got to change your strategies. And I think that's a good jumping off point in terms of how we tackle the challenges that we face in the Bahamas today. I would argue that whether you're talking about crime or illegal immigration or the challenges in education or concerns about national productivity, the issue we face in the Bahamas is that we have not been sufficiently honest with ourselves in defining the nature of the problems that we have. In fact, we're somewhere between self-deluding or outright lying to ourselves about the extent of the problems we face. Those of you who handle any kind of crises in your businesses or in personal lives will understand that the starting point for all of these is at least an acknowledgement that you have a problem. And in that regard, how we tackle the national problems, I think there's a function of leadership involved. We've got to, our leaders have got to, acknowledge the extent of the problems that we face, because I think it is only then that we are going to begin to, as a people, accept the extent to which we have got to make changes in our communities. But of course, we believe in speaking truth to power, but are always a bit reticent when it comes to having power speak truth back to us. So, despite the challenges we face as a country, I wake up every day inspired by the prospect of being a part of making the country great. I believe that we have come a long way, but I believe that we can be greater as a country. And it's easy to forget sometimes that we have made a lot of progress, but we can make more progress, better progress. The question is, who are the we in this, and what is it that we have to do? Of course, the we is each of us as individuals has got to make a personal commitment to making this country better for ourselves and for future generations. But press on to what? Press on to the development and implementation of what I argue is a transformation, or should be a transformation agenda. An agenda that seeks to deal with the core challenges we face as a country. So while I'm here, Rotarians, let me take this opportunity to thank you for the work that you are doing in this community and around the world. Rotary, Kiwanis International, and all the other service organizations, we can't begin to talk about the extent of the contribution that these organizations make. But what is apparent to me is that all of us, individually and as parts of organizations, have got to make personal commitments to do more than we are doing, because the times require it. Everybody has a role to play. And the ultimate solutions to our problems don't rest at the level of the government. They begin with we the people. In fact, I was rummaging through my files and came across a few lines I'd written down from Richard Nixon, of all people. He said, "There's no easy way to excellence, no shortcut to the truth, no magic wand that can produce a trained and disciplined mind without the hard discipline of learning. A nation can be only as great as its people want it to be. A nation can be only as free as its people insist that it be. A nation's laws can only be as strong as its people's will to see them enforced." Not only do we need new national leaders when it comes to raising the bar and changing our overall strategies, but we need a new style of leadership to emerge. Now, the last time I visited this club, I made the case that your involvement does not have to be at the level of politics. There are many other ways to make a difference. I find that the problem with us is that far too many of us have permitted our political affiliations to take precedence over our obligations as citizens. Individually, we have to take responsibility for our own actions. There's no question about that. But I cannot underestimate the significance of the party leaders, and I say leaders with an S. What we have found is that in order to pursue their own narrow, personal political agendas, political leaders tend to perpetuate that notion that there is a nefarious political motive behind everything that happens. Let me give you two examples. Some months ago, one of the local newspapers ran the story that there were pending executive changes at the National Insurance Board. Myself being a chairman of a public corporation, I immediately appreciated what the new managing director, Algernon Cargill, was seeking to do. But almost without delay, one of the opposition MPs claimed that the action was political. Apparently, some of the people must have belonged to the wrong political tribe, so they had to go, was his argument. By implication, their effectiveness as leaders of the organization had to be irrelevant. They had the wrong political stripe so off in their heads. Now, of course, he, that opposition politician, might have understood his action to be a clever political calculation. But what about the thousands of political supporters who trusted him? Is it that there is only the absence of political consideration when the PLP is in office? How, I ask, does the perpetuation of the view that what performance does, how does the How does the perpetuation of the view that performance does not matter help the organization? I argue that it's time for that old school politics to change. And again, I say it really starts with the top. There simply needs to be a greater degree of political maturity if we are to become less tribal. The second example is with the recent launch of the We the People community group started by Mr. Ed Fields and others. It didn't take long for the seemingly intelligent and responsible political leaders to start speculating and circulating the nonsense that this was some ingenious political effort to embolden Tommy Turnquest. In my view, We the People is a great citizen effort and one that we would expect the political leader to encourage and support and not undermine it by suggesting that there is some evil political motive afoot. Again, I say that we must become more mature and raise the level of debate. Now, those two examples I cite, you can, I'm sure, come up with dozens more across the political divide. So, besides promoting more grown-up discussions, I believe it's time for us to change the way we conduct politics in our country. Firstly, let's begin with campaign finance reform, and I'm glad to see that my party chairman and treasurer emeritus are in the room with me. So let's start with the coming general election and implement laws, or in preparation for them, implement laws requiring disclosure of the sources and amounts of campaigns contributions. Also, while I have not yet arrived at a definitive position, I think it's a good time to undertake a serious discussion about whether, in a country like ours where we rely on foreign direct investment, we ought to outlaw political contributions from foreign nationals and residents. Again, if we're interested in moving the country forward, we ought to engage in these kinds of debates. And when you consider the recent political or the ongoing debate over BTC and the constant charges of who is crooked and who is doing this for political favor, perhaps this is a good time for us to consider it. And consider the constant charges of who bought which election and for how much. Not a bad time for us to start thinking about whether we ought to require disclosure of what funds were spent, how much, and on what. Now, where will the political leadership come from to disclose where the money comes from? Perhaps a show of hands to everyone in the room who's actually made a contribution of more than $1,000 in the last election.
Plenty dollars. I can't ride both horses at the same time. You shouldn't be in the circus.
There are too many people who are unfortunate and as well off as you. In fact, at the recent Institute of Chartered Accountants Accountants Week session, I had an opportunity to sit around or stand around the table with some of my colleagues and ask them about their willingness to give money to political organizations. So I said, look, I don't want you all to influence one another. There are 4 of them. So I said, on a piece of paper, put down what you think is a reasonable amount that someone at your level ought to contribute that's meaningful to a political organization. The highest number I got from the 4 fellas was $800. So I said to them,
what was the lowest?
I said 250. I said, fellas, I was really looking for something more like $3,000 to $5,000. So if the chartered accountants who've got some names aren't contributing more than $1,000 to the campaign, who's paying for the laser show? Step number 2, I say let's put an end to part-time members of parliament and make the process of legislative reform more robust. I've had occasion to joke to friends before about how as a senator, backbenchers in the House and Senate were summoned to a meeting to be explained to by consultants and members of a certain department what was contained in a draft bill. And I thought to myself, well, what's wrong with this picture? Members of Parliament being explained by non-members of Parliament what's in the legislation. Given the scope, complexity, and risks associated with the myriad of issues we face, I think it's time to make a giant step to transform our institutions of government. Connected to this, of course, is the effective deployment of legislative committees and the use of public hearings. Our people want a greater say in how government functions. I think those are excellent means to give it to them. Well, I'll leave that one alone.
That's why we want here.
And actually, as business people, you might be interested in this. I think for me, high on the agenda is at least a consideration to this, whether or not we want to continue the tradition of what they call budget firm. Essentially, that process between the time the budget's completed and when it's announced to Parliament, there's obviously total secrecy and nobody except the Minister of Finance and 1 or 2 others who have any idea of what's in it. I think the last budget cycle where once the budget was announced and there was great uproar over what was in it, provides us with at least some forum for a meaningful discussion of whether or not we need to change that process. So, where will that leadership come from? Rotarians, I argue that it has to come from you. The challenge with the reform agenda is, of course, that someone has to take the lead. And every once in a while, you have to be prepared to put everything on the line and do the right thing. And sometimes the right thing is easy to do and bears very little risk. Some of you will remember that back in October of 1986, we left COB campus. We who were students left the campus and made our way to the office of the Prime Minister downtown. Price Smith was my vice president then, and Milo Butler III was our treasurer. Now, I remember on our planning meeting the evening before, we tried to figure out what is the most dramatic way for us to make a statement about the impact of the Minister of Immigration's actions on the college. Someone, and I don't remember exactly who it was, came up with the idea of marching downtown with a coffin to signify the death of the college of Bahamas. Of course, we all jumped onto that and thought it was a great idea, and so Milo Butler, having come from a family of that owned the mortuary, was designated as the person to go and bring the coffin the following day. Of course, when you look at the pictures, you will see that there was no coffin in the pictures. What was clear was that Milo's family was not about to let him carry away such a coffin for us to destroy. So we ended up marching downtown with a wreath. And of course, I did in fact present the wreath to Prime Minister Finling in his office. I'll save his response for another time. But sometimes the risks are great. And 6 months after those events, I was the keynote speaker at the National Convention of the Progressive Young Liberals. Michael Alcides, who was then a student at the college, still a student at St. Augustine's, but a friend of mine through Kiwanis, accompanied me to the speech and sat next to me about 3 rows from the front. Frank Smith, again my vice president, was taking out a position at the back of the hall. Now, the speech started out quite fine, but it didn't end that way. They booed, cheered, and of course some of the people walked out. Now, having finished my speech, I took my seat and was about to leave, only to be told that it was not safe for me to leave. So I sat and waited for tempers to cool down. And while I sat, the MC for the evening, whose name escapes me, he proceeded to read the sections from the Desiderata. You know, go placidly amidst the haste and noise. And then he got to the speak your truth quietly and clearly and listen to others. Even the dull and ignorant, they too have their stories. But I took it like a man. And when the time was right, the Royal Bahamas Police Force escorted me and Michael out of the hotel and across the bridge. 6 years later, we were back at it again. 6 years later, I was out of school then and I started working with the firm. And as I reflect, I remember that around 8:45 in the morning, I was running out of the office just as Michael Field, who was the managing partner, was walking in. So he said, good mornings, and I figured Mike obviously thought I'm on my way to a client. So we went to demonstrate, of course, before the Organization of American States, and were handing out flyers. And someone obviously realized we weren't supposed to be there, and we put an end to that. So we started to beat a retreat to the exit, but we were intercepted by the police. So while we were being questioned by the police, I'm not tuning him in at all. I'm thinking, how do I explain to Mike Fielder that I was arrested at a demonstration when he thought I was a flight? I raised those points, gentlemen, only to say that there are times when, to do the things that we need to do, you've got to put your head on the line. I remember years later, during the same demonstrations, we were driving around trying to find a dramatic way to make the point about freedom of speech. We considered breaking into the House of Assembly and knocking the MPs out. That came with too many risks. We considered going to Harold Road and disrupting the tower. The security guard was too intimidating, and that came with too many risks. So that's where the UAS presentation came in. So, gentlemen, I end by saying the idea that those of us who for many, many years have been enamored with the prospect of being a part of the development of the country, the idea that we do not take an opportunity to take a position on a national issue, I think should come as no surprise to anyone. I'll end there and take any questions you have.
Thank you very much. Well, we turn to an hour of questions. Give him a round of applause. And he will be. Thank you. Can you start? No, you were responsible.
Darron, I had anticipated you talking about the telco. And I'm just wondering if, because our chairman is here today, if he actually eliminated it.
But it's a rough crowd, Darron.